So in conclusion, the choice that you really have to make here is to either join Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem, thousands of Israeli conscientious objectors who refuse to serve in the occupied territories, the International Court of Justice, mountains of UN resolutions, renowned human rights figures like Jimmy Carter, to Nelson Mandela, to Desmond Tutu, to Arun Gandhi, in recognizing the obvious, condemning Israel's indiscriminate killing of Palestinian civilians, which is often willful according to those human rights reports, its apartheid system, its torture of Palestinians, its illegal settlement expansion, and so on. Or you could whitewash all of Israel's atrocities and focus single-mindedly on the rockets that are being fired by a starving population that is put under siege. And buy, I suppose, into the argument that perhaps Jimmy Carter is collaborating with Israeli human rights organizations to defame Israel or something, and then run with the obscene argument that the massacring of Palestinian civilians is legitimate Israeli self-defense. For those who would not like to take that latter course, I think it is obvious that you should join the rest of us, people who are morally consistent and people of conscience, who should be demanding that the US comply with US law and international law by suspending military aid to Israel until Israel respects international law and abides by human rights. Thank you.
Omar, thank you. We agreed on a format where Jeff would speak first and Omar would speak second. And now I'm going to give Omar a chance to ask Jeff a direct question, and then Jeff will have an opportunity to ask Omar a direct question. I may choose to follow up or not, depending on what we hear, and then we'll open the floor to questions and comments from all of you. Regrettably, we only have the auditorium till 7 o'clock or so, but we invite everyone to join us for a reception afterwards where both Omar and Jeff and I will be around and more than open and willing to speak further about our topic today. So as I said, I'd like to give Omar a chance to ask Jeff a question to proceed.
My question is on the two-state solution and Israeli settlement expansion. The Palestinian Authority, the entire Arab League, and the United Nations General Assembly every year votes in favor of the two-state solution that is based on Israel ending its occupation of the Palestinian territories, and Israel's response, in accordance, of course, with the UN resolutions and international law. And Israel's response has been the systematic building of more and more Israeli settlements throughout the occupied territories, which were particularly accelerated during the last year of the peace process, when they were supposed to be negotiating the end of the occupation. And of course, the destruction of Palestinian homes continues, as you and I are speaking right now, in the occupied territories, and that settlement expansion continues to go on. And my question is, what do you think is the reason of Israel continuing to build those settlements, and why do you think anybody should take Israel's wish for a two-state solution seriously in light of that?
Well, first of all, as you know, I think you probably know, Hamas, which we've been talking about, has specifically said it rejects a two-state solution. So when we hear that the absence of a two-state solution is the cause of Hamas's desperate firing 8,000 missiles, because what would you expect? There's no two-state solution. It's a tad curious. We talked about distasteful irony because Hamas, of course, has taken the position there's never going to be a two-state solution. We want you dead. We want you gone. We will annihilate you. We will not recognize you. We will not recognize the agreement signed by the Palestinians. So when I hear the two-state solution invoked in defense of a Hamas which has said we're not having a two-state solution under any circumstance, one may be forgiven for finding that somewhat curious. Now, on the question of settlements, one can agree or disagree about this settlement or that settlement, but it seems to me that on certain basic facts, you and I probably will agree. And that is that it was in 1948, right or wrong, that there was a two-state solution that was approved by the UN. Two states, Palestinian state, Jewish state, both Palestinian state, Palestinian Jews, Palestinian Arabs, living side by side. You may remember who accepted that. You may remember who rejected it. It was the Jews that accepted it. It was the it was the Arabs of the Palestinian leadership that rejected it flat out and then invaded Israel for the purpose of annihilating it. So it wasn't settlements that caused that. It wasn't a fence. It wasn't anybody being held in siege. Something must have been going on between 1948 and 1967. There was no Israeli presence in Gaza. There was no Israeli presence in the West Bank. There was no Israeli presence in East Jerusalem. Palestinian leadership, Arab leadership, had every chance in the world to create a two-state solution if that's what it was really about, and the attempts to continue to annihilate Israel continued. So obviously it was something else. Now in 2000, unless you think that President Clinton and Madeleine Albright and Dennis Ross are all sort of cooking this up, there was a two-state solution that was once again laid on the table. All of Gaza, every piece of Gaza, virtually all the West Bank, a capital in East Jerusalem, rejected by the Palestinian leadership, which not only rejected it, but then launched this 4-year effort to obliterate Israelis. Now, I'll conclude by saying that you suggested to these folks that, what would you expect Hamas to do but to blow up Israeli civilians because they're so frustrated. After all, they're blockaded, they're in a state of siege. Well, you may remember that the first thing that happened after the Palestinian leadership rejected once again this two-state solution in 2000 was that it launched what? It launched a 4-year effort to blow as many Israeli civilians to pieces from the West Bank. They were not held in the siege in West Bank. There was no fence. You may recall there wasn't any fence, right? No fence at all. So when we hear some of these things, and we hear that about the culture of killing, my dear God, one remembers in 2000, 2005, you'd see spokesmen on television reveling in the fact that the ratio of Israeli civilian deaths was high to Palestinian deaths was higher than it had ever been. And wasn't that a good thing? This picture of this poor boy, which if it is true, is an abomination and should be condemned, absolutely. And so I hope that you'll join me in publicly, and perhaps doing it on your website, condemning the use of Palestinian children to blow not only themselves, but Israeli civilians to pieces. That poor boy that you showed these guys it seemed to be tied to a truck. That is dreadful if it's true. One needs to kind of understand if it's true or not true, but let's assume that it's true, for argument's sake. How much more appalled you must be? You must be dreadfully appalled by the use of Palestinian children, some mentally challenged, to blow up themselves so that they may have the honor of blowing up Israeli civilians? So that is, I think, my response to the question of the supposed role that settlements have and fences have and siege has on the issue of this conflict.
I'm going to let Jeff ask Omar a direct question. I may have a question or two of my own. I acknowledge we're short on time, but Jeff, your chance to ask Omar a question.
On top.
Toward you.
Was anybody able to hear the last 10 minutes
You're
of
fine,
what I
you're
said?
fine. Yes, yes.
Good.
It's recorded.
Well, since you have invoked amnesty, and since you actually have a platform, I want to ask you if you'll join me in something. The Amnesty Report on Hamas human rights violations against other Palestinians says as follows, and I'm quoting from the Amnesty Report so that Josh will give me ample time to quote from it. Quote, Hamas forces and militias in the Gaza Strip have engaged in a campaign of abductions, deliberate and unlawful killings, torture, and death threats against those they accuse of collaborating with Israel, as well as opponents and critics. The quote goes on from the Amnesty Report. At least 24 men have been shot dead by Hamas gunmen in this period. Scores of others have been shot in the legs, kneecapped, or inflicted with other injuries intended to cause permanent disability, subjected to severe beatings which have caused multiple fractures and other injuries, or otherwise tortured or ill-treated. There is uncontrovertible evidence, this is the last paragraph I'll quote, that Hamas security forces and armed militias have been responsible for grave human rights abuses, and that the victims of such abuses and many others are being intimidated and discouraged from testifying about their ordeal. The Hamas de facto administration has displayed a flagrant disregard for the most fundamental human rights norms, not only allowing such abuses to be perpetuated, but actually facilitating and encouraging the abuses by justifying them and by granting absolute impunity to the perpetrators. Now, the Amnesty Report goes on to call for the Palestinian government to end the campaign of intimidation and violence directed at Palestinians, agree to an independent investigation of its human rights violations. So